everyone, and welcome to today's event, Motivational Interviewing with Bill Miller. Bill, a warm welcome to Online Events.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you here as we kind of start to get ready for the conference in New York, which you are keynoting at.
This is a nice way for me to do it. I'm in my easy chair in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So.
Yeah. This is the great thing about the internet, isn't it? We both don't need to go anywhere, and you can be very comfortable. We can just chat. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, great. And I just want to say a warm welcome to everybody who is joining us live on the website. It's great to have you here with us for this hour. And we're also live on Facebook. I was just telling you, Bill, it's a kind of new technology. It's still a bit wobbly. I think it's working. So if you're on Facebook and you have a question or a comment for Bill, please put it in the comments. Sandra's over there and she will let us know about that. If you're on the live page and you can see the chat room, please jump in there. Bill, I know you're up for some interaction and comments.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it'd be nice to hear what the colleagues who are with us are thinking. And if you're picking this up in the library or in a recording somewhere, well, thank you also for making some time to come and to listen. And we hope that this will be a really helpful conversation in terms of connecting motivational interviewing with the person-centered world, or maybe the other way around, I guess, which we hope will happen at the conference. And yeah, lots to think about around that. As we're getting started, Bill, maybe I could ask you to say a little bit about your journey. Would that be okay? I mean, how do you condense your work, I guess, into a few minutes? Maybe not easy, but...
Of course, yeah. I mean, in a way, the development of this approach is very similar to what happened with the person-centered approach. The foundational paper, the initial discussion paper, came out of a time I spent in Norway with psychologist colleagues there. And when I went to Norway, I had no notion of anything called motivational interviewing. And it arose from our talking to each other and interacting with each other around how you would work with clients. And they would ask me to demonstrate the way in which I was working with people, and they would stop and say, now, what are you thinking? You reflected something the client said. Well, of all the things the client said, why did you reflect that? Or you asked a particular question. Why did you ask that question when you could have asked many other questions? And they literally evoked from me a way of having a conversation about change with people that I was unaware of doing. I wasn't really conscious of the decision rules that I was indeed using. And in fact, I was lecturing on a very different kind of approach. I was trained as a behavior therapist. And yet those things fit together well. So I came back from the sabbatical and began testing this out just to see if there was anything to it. And 30 years later, we're still going. There are something like 450 controlled trials in the literature now, and just an enormous literature on the process of therapy, exactly the way Rogers pioneered it, of recording and listening to sessions and asking whether the things that we think are true really are true, knowing that our beliefs are just hypotheses. And consequently, the approach has changed over those 30 years substantially as we've learned more over time. But it didn't start from a theory. It started from practice.
Right. Oh, that's lovely to hear. And that's a real commonality in the approaches. Like Roger's theories grew out of his experience.
That's right.
As a therapist, yeah.
And his commitment to make it replicable so that other people could reproduce his work and see if they found it to be true also. And he really pioneered that in the field of psychotherapy at a time when psychotherapy was secret and behind closed doors. And that's been very much an important part of the world of motivational interviewing. So I'm interested in creating some bridges between motivational interviewing and the world of person-centered counseling, which is about 80% of what we do. This is fundamentally a person-centered approach.
Right. Oh, yeah. And when we were chatting last week, you were saying this like 450 controlled studies or more than. Like, that's a huge body of research to bring to the discussion. It's massive.
It's astonishing. I finally went through the last couple of weeks to just tally them up, and I was thinking there might be 300, and that's where this number came from, that I was able to find more than 450. Yeah.
And you're saying that when you were on the sabbatical, you were trained as a behavioural therapist, and like that was your, I guess, initial trainings. And what you found in your experiences, did that complement the training you'd already had, or was there a friction between those two ways of thinking? Or?
Well, the program in my graduate training at the University of Oregon, it was very, very behavioral. So this was in the era when you kind of chose a school of psychotherapy and you learned what was wrong with every other school of psychotherapy. But during our second year of training, we were supposed to have a year-long course in how to talk with clients. And none of the behavior therapy faculty wanted to teach it. So they went over to the counseling program, got a student of Leona Tyler, and she came and taught us Rogers in our second year, really before we began doing clinical work. So from the very beginning, this was a foundation for me of how you can do behavioral therapy, how you can do other kinds of approaches. And so they've always fit together nicely for me. I never was a behaviorist in terms of my personal outlook on life. I always had a humanistic perspective. But within that, you can certainly use the kinds of things that have been discovered in behavior therapy and cognitive therapy and so on. But how you do it matters. There are just enormous differences among therapists in their clients' outcomes. And one of the biggest predictors of that is empathy, accurate understanding.
Yes, yeah. So we might all have similar things that we do, but how we do it and the empathy that we have in our relationships make all the difference.
Well, things like empathy get dismissed as common factors sometimes, but I'm not sure they're all that common in practice, to tell you the truth. And they do make a big difference, and they have a big effect. So if this is something that really is so important, we should be studying it, as Rogers did, and teaching it as an evidence-based practice, which indeed empathic understanding is.
Yeah, like there's a lot of dialogue here in the UK, I guess, about, well, the core conditions, everybody does that, and then what comes next? I can see you shaking your head already at that idea.
It's not true that everybody does that, no.
Yeah. And so in the research that you and your colleagues have done, it's been very much about, like that original conversation in Norway, like what is making the difference, like the kind of expressions that are used, and yeah.
Well, what happens in the relationship? What's the dance like when you have a counseling session or a psychotherapy session or a conversation about change? What's actually going on? What are the things that make the biggest difference? And we've paid a lot of attention to client language. I know that factors like experiencing were being considered in the early work of Rogers and his students. But we've gotten even much more specific than that about language that people use essentially around their ambivalence about change, which is normal. You can elicit from people their arguments for change. You can elicit their arguments against change. They have both of them already there. But if you as a therapist argue for change, you will elicit the arguments against change from the client. And that's exactly what was going on in the addiction field in the 1970s when I entered that field. The counselors were very authoritarian, saying, here's what's wrong with you, and here's what you need to do, and here's your problem. That elicits, I don't have a problem, and I don't need to do this. And then clients got blamed for being in denial, when in fact that's a product of the interaction itself. So motivational interviewing really was about counseling in a way that helps people to feel understood and safe, and elicits from them, in addition, their own ideas about and their own motivations for change. And we've been able to show that that makes a difference, that you can predict from the process measures within a session what the outcome is going to be.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking I know that for myself as a person. If someone is insisting that it's one thing, I can just feel myself, even if I agree with them. I can feel my body want to go, no, I want to do the other. And like you could see that in the research, that the more the therapist pushed, the opposite happened.
Very much. In one of our studies, we could predict a very behavioral outcome, the number of drinks per week that the client was having a year later from one therapist response, which was confront. The more the therapist confronted, the more the client was drinking a year later. So we need to pay attention to what we're doing because it makes a difference. But the research has certainly made me much more conscious of my responsibility in working into a session, that it matters what I say and it matters what the client says. And we're having an interaction that can very well have an influence on that person's life course.
Oh, we've got so much to talk about here, haven't we? And the kind of things to say. You can probably see my eyes darting to the chat room, and we've got a question already.
Okay.
Maybe we could do that and bring in the comments from the colleagues in the group as we go. So thank you for these already. So just noticing that motivational interviewing is often presented as something that is particularly helpful for people with substance use problems. And the colleague would like to hear more about the range of issues for which motivational interviewing is helpful.
Yeah, okay. I developed it originally in working with people with alcohol problems, which was the place I was doing most of my own work. And pretty quickly we realized this would apply to addictions more generally. But really without much input from me, this quickly spread into healthcare. Why? Because if you particularly have a chronic illness, which is what healthcare is dealing with most often now, if you're diagnosed with diabetes, for example, what happens to your life, the quality of your life, the length of your life, is determined by behavior change or lack thereof. And yet most people after diagnosis don't make big changes in their behavior, even though that's the thing that will influence their health in the long run. They know what they need to do, they know they ought to do it, and yet don't do it. So it's that ambivalence situation that is the same dynamic that we see with addictions. And so quickly people began to realize this could be useful in helping people make health changes. It also, almost on its own, spread into corrections, because what are you hoping for when you're working with offenders that you're supervising? You're hoping for behavior change that they probably feel two ways about. It has now spread into social work, mental health, dentistry, coaching, sports coaching, education, management. I mean, it really is something that seems to be about human nature and not even specific to psychotherapy. It's something that is about how we talk to each other and how to have effective conversations that move in the direction of change rather than defensiveness.
Yeah. So these are huge fields of work, I guess.
And nothing I anticipated in the beginning.
Right. You weren't expecting that, yeah.
Not at all.
Wow. Well, and I have a question before I ask you some more about the kind of things that we say and how they impact the session. And just wondering, like the name motivational interviewing, like where that came from, or what was behind that name?
Well, in those conversations in Norway, as we were together kind of developing this set of kind of decision rules or principles by which you do this, I wrote what Rogers called the discussion paper, It's kind of trying to write down what we were learning, circulate it to the group, first of all, and we came to agreement about it. And then I sent it out to some colleagues and thought, well, we ought to have some kind of name for what this is. It clearly was about motivation, so that piece of it was easy. It's about calling forth the motivation that people already have, not installing motivation into them, but helping them find the motivation for it. So that was easy. I liked interviewing. It could have been motivational conversation, but in conversation, there's not one person with a unique responsibility. And interviewing, there is an interviewer. There is a person who has a different role there. And yet interviewing is a power-neutral term. The interviewer can be a powerful person, a boss who's deciding who to hire and is interviewing potential employees, in which case the power resides with the employer. But you could be a lowly college student interviewing famous people, and in that case the power is in the reverse situation. So I liked it because it's a conversation, which is what this is, and one person has a particular role, which is the interviewer, in it that's just a little bit different from the other. It's not just two people chatting, but one person with a particular responsibility and approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the power neutral aspect of that word interview. Yeah.
In English.
Yeah. And also there's a skill in interviewing, I guess. Like you have thought about how you bring yourself to the relationship, I guess, whether it's for a job or another setting. And it sounds like in the research you were finding out some particular things that were helpful or particularly unhelpful.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've learned a lot about that. I mean, like Rogers, we've studied the process of the interview and recorded these things, transcribed them, looked at exactly what's going on within the process, developed coding tools as Truex and Kharkov did, and began to test what actually seems to work and what doesn't seem to work. And it's clear that more confrontive or directive, authoritarian kinds of responses evoke defensiveness, just exactly as Rogers predicted, and that defensiveness predicts poor outcomes from treatment, as Rogers predicted. So that's clear. So at least one piece of it is, don't counsel in a way that evokes resistance and defensiveness. But beyond that, what do you do? And that's where the tools like accurate understanding, which is a learnable skill, are very important. And we've been able to demonstrate how important that is in motivational interviewing. And by the way, this is not just in motivational interviewing. I think, as Rogers thought, what we're studying are really processes of interpersonal influence or psychotherapy more generally. So this isn't just how this one particular treatment works. This seems to be true across the board, no matter what the theoretical orientation that the person has in mind.
Yeah. So the way that we're in the relationship has a big impact. And I think this is a massive debate in person-centered circles, I guess, about not being directive. And well, if we sit in the room, our physical presence in itself has an impact, and then what we choose to reflect, I guess, has an impact. And
makes a difference, yeah. And you have to decide what you're going to reflect. You have to decide what questions you will ask, and how do you do that? Well, we've developed some guidelines that seem to produce better outcomes of knowing what to reflect and knowing what questions to ask. And the directive issue is interesting. We used to call this a directive approach. Now we talk about it as directional. There's a direction to it. You know where you're going. You have a focus. Usually because it's what the client asked you to do. But together you've agreed we're on a journey, and that's where we want to go on this journey. Sometimes you work in a setting where the setting itself prescribes the target. So if you work in a smoking cessation clinic, when a client walks through the door, it's no mystery what you're going to be talking about. When you work in an addiction treatment center, clients figure we'll be talking about addiction. And in fact, if you're not doing your job. If you're a probation officer who works with sex offenders, you certainly have a direction of helping the person to move away from hurting other people, from harming other people further. And that's just a part of your role. And to sit there and be truly non-contingent, non-directive, you're not doing your job in that situation. Now, that's not the routine psychotherapy situation where clients bring in all sorts of things, and you're mostly following the client's lead in terms of what their goals are. But this grew up in alcohol treatment, where there was a very clear, measurable outcome, and where we're not wondering what we should be talking about, because drinking has such impact on health and the person and the people around them, and lots of potential harm. So to ignore that, to not have some direction about that, doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah, there's a very clear purpose to the relationship, and even in general psychotherapy, like in private practice, getting to know what the client, what they want out of that relationship, what are they coming and what are they paying us for? Like, where do they want to go? Is an important part of that assessment process.
Yes. Yeah. And I've conversations with people from the person-centered community. That doesn't seem surprising. I thought it might be an issue, but folks said, well, no, of course. I mean, if I'm talking to someone for whom their drug use is a huge obstacle to their growth, of course it's a goal to get that out of the way so they can get on with their life and continue to grow. So,
yeah, like something that might have felt like it could have got in the way of those two approaches coming together, maybe just seems like it evaporates in that kind of conversation. Yeah.
And Rogers himself moved away from the term non-directive, which is how he was describing his work originally, to person-centered, to client-centered and person-centered. And while that still was of value for him, that he not be the person telling people what to do and how they should live their lives, I think there was direction to his work, that he was hoping to help people move toward what they were meant to be, toward that person within them, and he wouldn't know necessarily what that was, but he had a clear sense that people have within them a positive potential, and given the right circumstances, just naturally grow in that direction.
Yeah, like that actualizing tendency that was so core to what Rogers thought about.
Yes. And what are you actualizing? It's that seed, that potential within the person that's different for different people.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things, and maybe we choose which way we go. We were going to talk about the 4 processes within motivational interviewing, and then also maybe some of the specific things that you would think about, like how you might phrase in terms of responding. Where should we go first, do you think? Or would they kind of interweave with each other, Bill?
They'll fit together. I think we'll come around to it either way. But I can talk about the 4 processes that we describe. The first one is engaging, which is forming a relationship. It's essentially answering the question: can we walk together? Can we have this conversation? And from the client's perspective, am I safe? Is this someone who will listen to me and not judge me and walk with me and accept me? And so that's a set of skills very much out of person-centered work. That's primarily what we're doing in that. The second process is focusing, and that's we're walking together. Where are we going? Where do we want to go together? So we're not just wandering around in circles, but we're getting clear the direction in which we're wanting to move together. With a clear direction, that is a focus in mind of where we want to go. The process that's fairly unique to motivational interviewing is evoking, which is this process of helping the person to find within themselves their own wisdom and motivations and ideas for how this change could happen for them, and getting to the place essentially of at least being willing, if not deciding, this is what I want to do. And in addictions, that's a huge piece. It turns out, we were surprised, once you help people make that decision, often they don't need much more than that. But beyond the evoking process, then planning, which is, okay, having decided this is what I want to do, how are you going to do it? And we still don't become authoritarian there. It's still a process of evoking from the person, given what they know about themselves, which is a lot, how this is going to fit into their life. So that sequence of 4 processes is how we talk about motivational interviewing now. And it's not linear. You really move back and forth among those processes over the course of counseling and sessions.
Right, so it's not, you move definitely from one stage to the other, and it could be, like lots of processes in psychotherapy, kind of messy and back and forward and in and out.
Very messy, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And what we learned around 1995, with our first edition came out in 1991, was how important the spirit of it is. This is what Rogers was calling attitude. Because we saw people trying to use the techniques that we were talking about, and it felt all wrong. It was like they were trying to use techniques on people, or to do something to them, or to trick them into changing in some way and be clever. And it just wasn't what we had in mind. It was, I said, the words without the music. And so we began putting right up front the spirit of motivational interviewing. Which is collaborative. It's a partnership, not an expert telling someone what to do. Acceptance as a key piece, just as it was for Rogers. Evoking, calling forth from the person their own wisdom rather than trying to install something that you imagine they're lacking. So those elements and compassion. I mean, knowing that the reason I'm sitting here is for that other person's welfare, not for mine. This is not about me. This is about what's best for the other person, and that's the only consideration.
Yeah, so someone could read the work and think, right, if I just deploy these techniques, this is what it is. And I guess you saw some colleagues doing that, but it doesn't work without the value system, I guess, or the attitudes.
Yeah,
the spirit.
Certainly not what we had in mind. One fellow picked up some of our techniques and wrote a book called "How to Get Anybody to Do Anything in 7 Minutes or Less," which is how do you trick people into doing what you want them to do, basically. It's got some techniques in it, but it wholly lacks the attitude or the spirit, which is where this came from.
Yeah. So what you noticed about how being in relation, like there's certain things that we do in relationship that's helpful, but it has to be in relationship, I guess. It has to be making that journey together. It must be rooted in that experience.
And it cannot be separated from the person who's doing the interviewing. And that's true of any psychotherapy. There is no such thing as a manual guided therapy without someone who's delivering it, and what's a consistent finding is whatever the manual, whatever the therapy, whatever the techniques, there are huge differences among therapists who are ostensibly delivering the same treatment. And one of the biggest predictors of client outcome is which therapist they work with. So there's a how you do it that's certainly in behavior therapy just was not very well emphasized, that is really important. And I think that's part of the struggle now between evidence-based treatment and general factors. And for me, that's a both and issue, not an either or issue.
Yeah, that sounds really important, because we're so often splitting those things. But like your experiences, they must come together. We must.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we do have our technique, what we do, but it's got to be in the way that we do it too.
And they do come together. You can't separate them. So you can give people a manual, but you don't really know what they're doing unless you record it and listen to it and analyze it precisely as Rogers allowed his own work to be analyzed.
Yeah. no wonder we so easily get lost in these conversations when we're trying to work out which one is it.
Yeah.
When it's actually both. That's there's the
Well, there's something in our brains that likes either or, black and white, and so we get caught in those, is this right or is that right kind of argument, and usually it's yes and, it's just somewhere in between.
Yeah. It's so good to be reminded of that, Bill. I know my brain hates that, and can get right into that place.
Oh, we love it, yeah.
Yeah.
And negativity and opposition is so attractive also. We get hooked by it. And a real skill in motivational interviewing is to not get hooked by that, to not respond as your gut wants to respond immediately, but patiently trust and stay with the method itself, and not try to fix something, not try to correct something immediately, because that will probably lead you down the wrong path.
Yeah, I think our stories that we hear from each other can be so compelling, and the dramas, and we can so easily get drawn in. I'm noticing some comments, really appreciating the things that you're saying in the chat room here, Bill, about that expression, interviewer being power neutral. Really enjoying that, and loving that phrase, can we walk together? Or that question, I guess. Starting there. A question I guess we could take, so maybe this might take us down a tangent, we'll see, but a colleague who's wanting to take the ideas of motivational interviewing to my colleagues at work in a mental health setting, and wondering what would be the kind of ideas that would be helpful. I guess is there something about taking the philosophy in first and then the techniques, or maybe the other way around? Or have you got any ideas how, if you're wanting to be persuasive about the power of this approach, how might you talk about it?
Well, I can tell you what you don't do, which is to say you're doing it all wrong and I have the answer for you. It's entirely inconsistent with the approach itself. In a way, in teaching, I try to be the way of being that I'm hoping people will learn as well. That's, I guess, a more advanced question. But the spirit and the attitude, the techniques or the attitude and the method, I really teach them together. If you only try to teach the spirit or the attitude, there's no skeleton. It doesn't have anything to hang on, and you can get lost in the abstract. If you only teach the techniques without understanding the attitude and the heart set with which you practice, then you wind up with techniques that you're trying to be clever with and use on people. And this is something you do with people and for people, not something you do to people or on people, So even those prepositions in English make a difference. So I do both. I mean, I start off usually talking about the spirit and just kind of giving us a set for a container for the things we're going to put in it. But then pretty quickly they begin to practice into actually doing, because I know that hearing about this doesn't change practice behavior. I know that reading our book doesn't change practice behavior. Watching tapes doesn't change practice behavior. And I learned to my horror that coming to a 2-day workshop with me doesn't change practice behavior. I made the mistake of evaluating my own training by listening to practice samples before and after training, and there wasn't a whole lot of evidence that I had been there, But they believed they had learned it and were now doing it. And were less interested in learning more because they thought they already had it. Even though when you listen to the tapes, it's not there. So that's not a problem with them. That's a problem with me. That's a problem with the way I'm teaching, because I'm implying that these are tricks you can learn in a 2-day workshop and then you've got it. Now we say at the end of an initial workshop, this is the beginning of learning. And you learn this by practice and getting feedback. And ideally some coaching. It's the way you learn any complex skill, like a sport. You don't hire a tennis coach and say, "Don't watch me." I'd be too embarrassed. You don't hire a piano teacher and say, "Don't listen to me." I couldn't bear for you to listen to me. Because it's the listening and the watching that allows the coach to know what to suggest next. For the tennis coach, it's just turn your grip a little bit and widen your stance a bit. For the piano teacher, it's curve your fingers a little more, there, like that. So just little suggestions like that. And we found that those two things, feedback based on observed practice and gentle coaching, make a huge difference in learning this. So there's now a very large literature on how do you teach and how do you learn motivational interviewing, resulting, I think, largely from my shock at finding out that a workshop doesn't do it. And in retrospect, I wondered why I ever thought that a 2-day workshop would change complex behavior.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But it is still, at least in this country, it is still kind of our model of professional education that you come in and warm a chair for a day or two, and then you got it.
Yeah. But to change how we relate to each other, it's a big job. Yeah.
And yet learnable. And we've never found a relationship between the number of years of education a person's completed and their ability to learn motivational interviewing. And I think Roger's found the same, that this is something that you can teach to people who don't have professional degrees. It's a way of being with people that can be used in so many different areas, and it's not the unique province of therapy professionals.
Right. Yeah. Well, I can see a comment in the chat room there, colleagues saying it's good to hear that not much has changed. When I used it 15 years ago, it's still a skill. No, it's not a skill, but part of being. So it's how, I think, I just kind of butchered that comment, but I think colleague is saying it's about how we are.
Yeah, Roger's last book was called A Way of Being, and when I found it, I wept. I said, that's exactly what I'm beginning to feel about this. That, yes, it's learnable. Yes, there are techniques that you can practice, and as you practice them, you begin to learn the spirit of it as well. But over time, it becomes a way of being with people. It becomes part of who you are. And I would love to understand more how learning this changes the practitioner, because I know it certainly changed me. And we don't know as much about that. But I think learning this method, yes, is beneficial for your clients, but also can have a huge impact on who you are as a person.
Do you have a guess about what it does to the practitioner, or a sense of how we're changed by practicing this?
Well, I go back to Rogers again, that accurate understanding you just get better at the more you listen to people with the only goal of being sure you're understanding correctly. The more you do that, the better you get at guessing, the better you get at understanding what people mean. And the other thing that I'm pretty sure it changes is acceptance, is what got called unconditional positive regard, but I think of it even more broadly of being willing to let the person be as they are and respect them and know that they don't have to prove their worth to you. And that they get to make the choices about their own behavior. Boy, how we forget that one. Tell people what they have to do. They don't have to do that. So to know and honor their autonomy, to extend acceptance to people as they are, because that's what allows them to change. Isn't that a lovely paradox that Rogers found, that when you feel unacceptable, you can't change? And that when you experience acceptance as you are, it becomes possible to change.
Yeah. It's a gorgeous paradox, and
I know most good truths are.
Yes. It can drive us crazy in the sessions, I guess, when we lose our grip on it. But it's just a gorgeous paradox. Yeah. And I'm thinking about our conversation that we had earlier about resistance, I guess, and some of the like the real correlation that you found to like what we might respond to or what the client is saying. Could we talk some
Yeah,
about some of that? Yeah.
Rogers was certainly interested in resistance too, and it was a very big concept in the psychodynamic approaches at the time. In our first two editions of the book, we used the term, and in fact, in a way, it was a reason why people were coming to training. How can I deal with most impossible, resistant, difficult people?
I've got the worst clients in the world. What am I going to
These
do?
terrible people. Yeah, how can I beat them? And we knew we were uncomfortable with it, especially in the second edition. It didn't feel quite right because there's something about the term resistance that's blaming the person for what they're doing. Here I am, this expert with all this wonderful wisdom, and you are not doing what I'm telling you to do. What's the matter with you? Whereas resistance happens only in an interpersonal context. It happens in a relationship, and both people contribute to it. But when we wrote the third edition, we had a very big change in how we talk about and think and write about resistance. Part of it happened because our colleague Teresa Moyers said, most of what you guys are calling resistance is just one half of the client's ambivalence. It's just what we now call sustained talk. It's their talk that says, I really don't want to change, and I don't need to change, and how I am right now is just fine. And there's nothing abnormal about that. People are normally there when they're thinking about change. It's normal to both want and not want change at the same time. So why is that resistance? That's just ordinary human stuff. And that's absolutely right. And that was most of what we were labeling as resistance. Just whenever the client says anything that favors not changing. But then we asked the interesting question, suppose you take what therapists mean by resistance and subtract from it client sustained talk, the client's kind of arguments against change. So you take that away. Is there anything left? And there is. And what's left we now call discord. It's things the client says that signal we're not dancing together well. We're not moving together well. I'm not comfortable in our relationship at the moment. And these, unlike sustained talk, which about smoking might be, I don't want to stop smoking. I like cigarettes. I don't need to quit. That's just about the smoking, about the goal. These discord statements tend to have you in them. You don't understand how hard this is for me. Who are you to tell me what to do? That's saying you're stepping on my toes as we're dancing together here. Now that's a very important signal. We know from research all the way back to the 60s that when you begin getting a lot of those kinds of statements, you see poor outcomes from psychotherapy. And we also know from our own research that if you get a lot of sustained talk, more than or equal amount to change talk, you're also not going to see change. So how you respond to those two things is very important. And what we've developed is a way of responding to them. We used to call it rolling with resistance. We're now trying to not use the term resistance because it's kind of a blaming, pejorative term. But how to respond to this, and what you don't do essentially is push back. What you don't do is oppose it, argue against it, try to reason the person out of it, overcome it. Those kinds of things go in the wrong direction. And what do you do most often? You listen. You practice accurate empathy for what the person's telling you, and their need to say it goes down because they know you got it. They know you hear it.
Yeah. So if I'm saying something to you like, like you don't understand what I'm telling you here, you're not getting it. Like the kind of response here would be helpful is more like, oh, what am I not hearing from you, John? Or like as opposed to, well, if you just do it, it'll make a difference.
Yes, of course you don't do the latter.
Yes.
No, I would say, I'm sorry, you're right. I think I'm not understanding you well. So help me understand. What am I missing here? And to listen well, again. Because your client is always telling you something. when you're trying to learn the skill of reflective listening. A nice thing about it is every time you try it, every time you offer a reflection or a paraphrase, you get immediate feedback as to whether it was right. The client essentially says, yes, and, or the client says, no, and you get some more information either way. So there's no penalty for missing. But you're constantly learning how accurate your empathic statement was. Right? The same thing with motivational interviewing. We've learned what to attend to of all the things that clients say. And when you begin to hear change talk, that's your client saying, thank you, you're doing this well. And when you begin to hear the person becoming defensive or giving you discord statements or making arguments against change, that's your client saying, why don't you try something different? Why don't you not do more of what you were just doing? And instead of what your gut wants to do, which is even push harder, you listen harder. You learn to respond in a way that doesn't strengthen what we think of as resistance.
Yeah, I really like how you frame the understanding of what's going on. Like if I can say to myself, my client's saying, "Oh, do more of this," or "Do a little bit less of that." That, like, I can even get myself out of that kind of who's right here, who's wrong. It's more like
the client's your teacher.
Yeah. And that the word that you use, discord, like in music, you can just hear it. If you play a wrong note, you get that instant feedback. You can feel it in your body, or if you're listening to a band that are not tight or something. It can be like that in therapy too. It just doesn't feel like it's working. And
that's right. And the client will tell you, you can see it. And discord requires two notes. One note cannot be discordant. You must have two.
Yeah. And so the harder that we play our note in opposition to the clients, the harder we push.
The worse it gets, yeah.
And here is such, you can just, when you said at the beginning, like this is very much a client-centered, a person-centered way of approaching people. It just seems so clear to me when you're saying the response to something not working is more understanding, more empathy.
Yes.
A deeper understanding.
You're always paying attention to what the person is telling you and doing in the moment. And when you lose that, you're not doing it right. But an interesting finding in one meta-analysis of motivational interviewing is that the effectiveness of motivational interviewing was cut in half when a manual was being used. Now, usually the assumption is therapy manuals are a good thing, and that if you have a manual and you're following it, you'll be a better therapist. We found exactly the opposite. That when there was no manual there in front of the therapist, they had twice as big an effect as when they were trying to follow a manual, which makes perfect sense to me, that if you're paying more attention to your manual than to your client, you are not doing it right.
Yeah. The attention must be on the client.
They're telling you if you're doing it right or not.
Yes. Yeah, like every response and even no response there's something in all of that, that's telling us what's helpful. And it can be so easy when we're getting a bit distressed as therapists, if we're in the therapist role, or if we're losing our confidence a bit, we can get defensive and start to push and not listen. So,
that's something else that I find also learning motivational interviewing seems to do. It seems to lift a burden off the back of the therapist. Because if you feel like you have to make people change, that's a terrible burden. And the truth is that you can't. If you feel like you have to have all the answers, what a terrible burden that is, because you don't. And the person with the answers is sitting across from you. And so realizing that, and that there's a way of being with people that helps the answers to come from them, is a real relief. And I've heard that countless times from people who have learned and practiced this, that it just lifted a burden off of them, and they so much more enjoy their work, and at the end of the day feel tired but happy.
Yeah, yeah, just giving that freedom to the practitioner. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm just seeing the comments in the chat room, people really appreciating what you're saying about and agreeing about trusting the client's process, trusting the client's locus of control, holding a curious attitude about the client. Yeah,
Very important. It's part of the mind and the heart that you bring to it. That you don't know this person. You don't know the answers for them. They have them, and you need to understand how they experience the world and reality.
I wonder, we've got a little over 5 minutes left, so not much time. I wonder if there's anything else in the, well, sure, there's loads of things, but for a humanistic practitioner, maybe a person-centered practitioner, very focused on the relationship, but there might be something that you found that's maybe counterintuitive about, like something that actually, if we, a kind of response that can be helpful. That's not a very articulate question, but like things that we can do that really do make a difference.
Well, I mean, I can be specific. I mean, what kinds of questions are helpful to ask? And one answer to that is helpful questions are those, the answer to which is change talk. The answer to which is why you would want to make this change, how you would do it, what are some good reasons for doing it, how important is it, and why is it important. If you did decide to do this, given what you know about yourself, which is a lot, how would you go about it in order to succeed? You know? What are you willing to try first? What's your hunch about what would be a good step for you? Now, all of those are open questions, no closed questions. All of those are open questions, the natural answer to which is change talk. And when you ask a question like that, you likely will get change talk in response, which we know is related to better outcomes. You tend not to ask questions like, why haven't you changed? You know, why are you still drinking? You know, the answer to that is the opposite of change talk. It's sustained talk. It matters what you ask. It also matters what you reflect. If a person says, you know, I don't think I have a problem with drinking. I mean, I know sometimes I overdo it, but I don't think it's a problem. I think it's okay. And I don't know if I could change it anyhow. They said a lot. What do you reflect? Do you reflect you don't think you have a problem? What the client says next will be to talk more about why they don't have a problem. Do you reflect, so you think it could be very difficult to make a change like this? And if you reflect that, the client will talk about why it's difficult to make the change. If you hear the change talk in there, and you say, and at the same time you can see that sometimes you overdo it, the next thing the client is likely to say is to talk more about that, to give you change talk. And so it's attuning your ear to client language that helps them move in the direction of the change that they want to make or need to make, and learning to ask questions and offer reflections and do summaries that help them move in that direction. Because when I was being trained in client-centered counseling, no one really taught me which questions to ask. No one really taught me, of all the things the client says, that these are the things to reflect, except maybe the feeling tone in it. And nobody, I was told, you know, form a summary at the end, but nobody told me what to put in it. And the specifics that have come out of our psycholinguistic research, I think, are very helpful in remembering what's helpful for me to ask and not helpful, what's helpful for me to reflect, what's most important for me to be sure I hear and reflect and put into summaries. So that's just a little bit of the specifics of it that maybe give you a little bit of flavor of the technique side. That is not the primary piece of it, and yet is quite important.
Yeah, like the primary piece is really rooted in our heart set, like how we approach the other person, and then how we make that relationship. Yeah. And in that, when a client is making a response, just as you've described, it can be a real challenge to catch the change talk in that. Like, what is it that they're saying? Like, there's lots about staying as they are. But you just caught that bit about, well, and sometimes you overdo it, and what's that like, or how is that for you, or...
It's hearing those little golden nuggets in there and shining a light on them, or sometimes I say they're like little smoldering coals, and you need to breathe on them and flame, so it's ear tuning. And one of the things that often happens when I'm listening to practice tapes is people missing just golden pieces of change talk, and it's as if the client never said it. It just goes by without much attention being paid to it.
And I think it makes so much sense what you're saying to me, the desire to reflect and knowing that empathy is helpful. And the client says a lot, like, what do I choose? And knowing that there is that in the research, some real predictors of what's helpful to the client and what we choose to breathe on, I guess.
And Rogers did that too. I mean, Charles Truex published a study in '66 showing that Rogers was much more likely to respond with reflection and so on, and affirmation, to certain kinds of client talk, and other things just kind of let them go by. So I think it's truly hard, if not bizarre, to be non-contingent in responding to what a person is saying to you. I think we all develop kind of implicit rules about what we should be reflecting and summarizing and what's most important. And here we have some evidence-based guidelines and about what really matters and what's most likely to help the person move in the direction of change.
Yeah. Like most often we just, if we think we're responding neutral, it's because we haven't worked out what our bias is.
That's right.
Yeah, which is an important part of our training, I guess, and having a sense of what's helpful. Yeah. Bill, we've been chatting for an hour already, and it feels like we are scratching the surface of an incredible body of work that has mushroomed into something. Well, it sounds like it's way beyond what you've expected, Bill.
Far beyond, yeah. And I mean, one reason I'd like to create this bridge is I think the client-centered or person-centered community is suffering from attacks about not having an evidence base. And here is a person-centered approach with an enormous evidence base that grew directly out of Carl Rogers' work. And in that regard, I think dialogue is helpful too.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a great moment to encourage people to come to the PCE conference in New York, where you will be keynoting, and you'll also be delivering a workshop for a couple of days before the conference as well. So that will be an opportunity for people to come and spend some more time thinking about that bridge as well. Like, how can the two approaches work together well, certainly here in the UK, there is so much going on in the more behavioural approaches. There's a lot of power and funding there. So to be able to have other things, other resources to bring into those conversations feels really important. So if colleagues can come to the conference and be in dialogue with you there, I guess that could be really helpful.
I look forward to it.
Absolutely. And if people aren't able to make it to the conference, I'm really glad we've been able to have this time together, maybe with us live on the website or in the recording. And are there other places that you would encourage colleagues to go to learn more about this work? Bill?
Well, the website motivationalinterviewing.org, O-R-G, just has a huge amount of information on it, and geographic directory of trainers and so forth. So there's more there than you want to know, I expect, but some pretty good resources on that website.
So that's a great place to start in terms of resources, and also making some connections with colleagues, I guess. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I want to say thank you to everybody who's joined us live. We really appreciate you being here, and the comments and the questions. We haven't been able to get to everything, so sorry if you have made some comments. If you can come to the conference and continue the conversation, that would be fantastic. And Bill, I want to say thank you to you for making some time, not just in our hour here, but in preparing for the event, and thinking about being here and making the bridges between the approaches. We really appreciate your time and your energy for that. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Well, I'll look forward to seeing you at the conference in person,
Yes.
and so the next time we get a chance to speak together. Thank you so much, Bill.
You're most welcome.
Bye for now.